Oren Ergas, docente, investigador y escritor adscrito a la Beit Berl College de Israel, profundiza aquí en las prácticas contemplativas como maneras de ampliar la consciencia y de cultivar el potencial humano en pro de una vida satisfactoria y su relación con la educación. Desde esta posición, la educación contemplativa es un concepto que trasciende al de educación tradicional. Es una forma de entrenamiento mental y conductual que está destinada a producir alteraciones en el proceso cognoscitivo básico y en los procesos emocionales para mejorar los rasgos de carácter particular que se consideran virtuosos, tales como la honestidad y la bondad. Como práctica pedagógica, la contemplación exige entrenamiento físico y mental, exhorta al control de la voluntad, permite observar sin juzgar, produciendo un cambio sustancial que potencia la paulatina humanización consciente.
Hello everyone, my name is Oren Ergas and I work at the Faculty of Education at Beit Berl College in Israel. And in this talk, I'll be speaking about contemplative education and mindfulness in education. So the aims of the talk are to define what contemplative education is. It involves contemplative practices, which we'll define as well, and we'll define mindfulness, which is a particular type of contemplative practice. So then we'll focus a bit on mindfulness practice and discuss its relation to education. So first of all, contemplative education is the field that involves the study, justification, and critique of contemplative practices such as yoga and mindfulness in education. Contemplative education is about asking ourselves, what is the relationship between practices such as yoga, meditation, tai chi, qigong, which you may have heard of, and education? Because generally speaking, when we speak about education, we're used to thinking about studying math, learning geography, science, literature, Bible, and so forth. And contemplative practices bring something quite different to this arena. Contemplative practices like meditation, suddenly you see people sitting down, closing their eyes, or doing a yogic posture. It seems a bit out of place. So contemplative education is about explaining why there may be a place for these practices in education. So this is about asking how and why are these practices related to education? What happens in the field of contemplative education? That is, how much are these practices spreading out in education and educational systems around the world and so forth? It's also about critiquing these practices. Maybe this is not such a good idea. Maybe it is such a good idea. We need to understand what this is about in order to develop some kind of substantiated opinion about whether we want this in education or not. So as promised, let's define what these practices are. What's the common denominator of practices such as yoga, meditation, tai chi, Feldenkrais technique, or others? And don't worry if you do not know these practices, we'll define them. So I'm going to give two kinds of definitions. The first definition comes from a group of scientists who've developed a very rigorous definition of these practices. And they say that these practices, contemplative practices, train skills by placing some constraints on a normally unregulated mental or physical habit. They require individuals to practice volitional control to sustain the focus of attention on particular objects. Sustaining attention, just like you're attending to me now, this is about training our attention. These are forms of mental and behavioral training that are intended to produce alterations, changes, in basic cognitive and emotional processes, and to enhance particular character traits that are considered virtuous, such as honesty and kindness. But these are a lot of words, and you can look at the slides so you can get more deeply into it. That's one definition, and it comes from scientists. It has scientific terms in it, such as volitional control to sustain attention, changes in emotional and cognitive processes. And we'll break that down a bit later. I want to give another definition that's more general and kind of anthropological. And this comes from the Brown University's Contemplative Studies bachelor's degree, which focuses on contemplative practices. And this is a definition by Harold Roth, who initiated this bachelor's degree. And he says the contemplative practices are the ways that human beings across cultures and across time have found to concentrate, broaden, and deepen conscious awareness as the gateway to cultivating their full potential and to leading more meaningful and fulfilling lives. It's easier actually to try a contemplative practice and understand a bit more what these definitions actually say. So we're going to focus on mindfulness practice. Mindfulness is a word that you may have heard in various contexts. So just as kind of a simple way to look at it, you can see mindfulness as a practice of paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, and in the present, and non-judgmentally, which we'll try in a moment. And this is a definition given by John Kabat-Zinn, who is considered the father of modern mindfulness. Mindfulness is also a state of mind. It's a momentary experience of being fully aware of what we're doing, of being open, accepting, non-judging, grounded, and kind. And you can add other characteristics to this state of mind. It also can be understood as a trait. A trait means that it becomes a personality trait, a personality characteristic that is a mindful person. So mindfulness practice is about practicing this state of mind of being mindful. And if you practice it a lot, maybe this becomes actually a personality trait of yours. Let's try this out. I'm going to do a simple practice with you, which comes from a very valuable program coming from the UK called the Mindfulness in Schools Project. And this is taken from there. So what we'll do is we're going to clap our hands 3 times and then try to follow my instructions. So it'll be great if you can do it with me. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, and we'll clap our hands. 1, 2, 3. Now place your hands one parallel to the other. And if you want, you can close your eyes and try to bring your attention to the sensations and the feelings that you experience in the palms of your hands. Maybe there's a tingling sensation, maybe warmth, itching, sweating, any kind of sensation that you feel is fine. You're just bringing your attention to that area. Now try to focus on the index finger of the left hand. So you bring your attention to that finger and see what you can experience there. How about the pinky of the right hand? And now open your awareness to both palms again. See what you experience now. And when you're ready, open your eyes. So that was paying attention in the present moment of our sensations in our hands, non-judgmentally. That is, we did not care if these are nice sensations or unpleasant sensations. We just observe them. We're not trying to create any sensation. We're just observing what's there. And we do this on purpose. That's a very short example of a mindfulness practice. There are many different mindfulness practices, and we won't get into that too much, but this is just so you have an idea of how these practices train our attention. They ask us to exercise volitional control of attention, and we heard various claims about what these practices can develop. And we'll get to that in a moment when we connect this to education. So a little bit more about mindfulness practice. Mindfulness practice can be seen as one or a group of practices within the broader family of contemplative practices, which include also yoga, qigong, and so forth. Mindfulness can also be seen as a basis for all contemplative practices. That is, if you practice yoga or you practice qigong or tai chi, you have to be mindfulness while practicing it, or otherwise you're not really practicing this contemplative practice. Let's connect this a bit to education. So if we're speaking about training attention, okay, attention is the very basis for learning anything. You can't learn math, you can't learn science or literature or whatever if you're not attending appropriately. So if this practice can enhance our attention, as actually scientific research shows, then this can certainly contribute to any kind of academic learning that happens in educational systems. The second aspect that I want to point to has to do with character and moral education. We saw in the first definition that this is about enhancing character traits that are considered virtuous, such as honesty and kindness. That's certainly something we want in our educational systems. And also, though it is not always spoken about, we do want our students to experience well-being, and in fact, we may actually prepare them for a life that we hope in which they'll expect well-being. So if this is about cultivating the full potential of the human being and about leading meaningful lives, then this is definitely something that we want in our educational system as well. So at least when we look at these educational aims, contemplative practices can certainly contribute to them, and there's nothing special about them in that sense. Maybe the practice looks a little bit different, but we actually, when we practice contemplative practices, we're aiming at common educational aims. A brief history of where mindfulness comes from. So mindfulness is actually originates in the 5th or 6th centuries BCE from Buddhism. It's a practice that the Buddha taught, but only at the end of the 19th century was the word mindfulness actually coined as it was translated from the Pali language. Originally, mindfulness connotes with the term sati from the Pali language, and we won't get into the etymology here too much. In 1979, John Kabat-Zinn, whom I mentioned earlier on, developed a practice called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, a course called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, and this was a result of his own practice of Buddhist meditation. He saw that if he'd offer this practice without the Buddhist connotations and without Buddhist terms to patients who are suffering from chronic illnesses such as chronic back pain, chronic heart conditions, depression, and so forth, people that conventional medicine is having a hard time to help, then he might help these people deal better with their conditions and improve the quality of their lives. So he developed this course, which is an 8-week course, and very slowly, results were very impressive, and the medical community began to become very interested in the fact that here's a meditational practice that can actually improve the conditions of these patients. So from there, the scientific community started to explore what's happening in the body of these people, what's happening in their psychological well-being when they practice meditation. So if you look at a chart that counts how many publications and scientific studies have been published since 1980 to our times, you'll see that there's an exponential rise of publication from around the year 2000. And to date, there are about probably 7,000 studies on this practice and how it affects the human brain, the human body, how it affects the immune system, how it affects attention, how it affects the sense of meaning in life, and so forth. So a lot of these studies actually focused on the brain to see whether if someone actually practices something that we did just now, and he practices it for extended amounts of time, whether this has effects on how the brain processes knowledges, and perhaps it actually affects the connections between synapses in the brain. So studies reports effects on stress reduction, on the improvement of attention, memory, self-regulation, immune system, and overall well-being. When we focus now on education, together with my colleague, Professor Leonor Hadar, we conducted a study in which we counted and explored all the publications on mindfulness implemented in educational systems between 2002 and 2017, and we found almost 450 publications. And since 2017, 4 years have passed, and they're probably double that number now. And about 300 of these publications involved implementation of mindfulness in educational systems. And we'll speak about that in a moment and say what that means. Right now, there are a number of programs who are spread out across the United States, across Europe, and other parts of the world, in which mindfulness is implemented in educational systems. So two of the most famous ones are MindUp and the Mindfulness in Schools project, which I just mentioned. And these already have spread out to millions of students. When we look at what's happening in education, in educational systems and the implementation of mindfulness, we mostly find what is called mindfulness-based interventions, MBIs. So these are short programs in which students are taught to practice mindfulness in various ways, students and teachers. And this is integrated into the curriculum in some way, sometimes in the end of the day, sometimes throughout the day, sometimes in the beginning of the day. And generally, these MBIs are about enhancing student well-being, student and teachers' well-being, reducing burnout. It's also about enhancing social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is a discourse all its own, which has been connecting with mindfulness, has to do with improving self and social awareness, the ability to manage ourselves, to communicate with others, and to conduct ourselves in a responsible way, responsible decision-making, and so forth. This is also about enhancing cognitive functions such as attention and memory. So there are many studies done in education, and just looking at some meta-analytical studies, those that look at various implementations of mindfulness across schools, such studies have found that mindfulness training in schools has positive effects on cognitive functions, on psychological measures of stress, coping, and resilience. A study conducted on teachers that reviewed many programs implemented with teachers showed that the practice reduces anxiety, distress, anger, and depression, and burnout in teachers. It improves resilience, enhances compassion and empathy, emotional regulation, well-being, satisfaction of job, and health. These are all very desirable outcomes And if our teachers feel better in their job, then they do a better job teaching students and forge nurturing relationships with their students. But I want to point to a deeper aspect of these practices, mindfulness, implemented in education. And this has to do with the fact that when we practice mindfulness, we do something very, very different than what we do when we normally study in schools. Normally, when we study in schools, we attend out. We attend to the PowerPoint presentation, to the board, to the teacher, to the classroom discussion. When we practice mindfulness, we shift our attention inwards. Suddenly, our embodied experience becomes part of the curriculum. Our sensations, our emotions, our thoughts. What is important to note here is that most students are not going to be historians, mathematicians, scientists, or whatever we study there in school, but all of the students are going to have to deal with their emotional lives, with their decision making, with their thoughts. Throughout our day, we move around with these minds of ours, and there's constant content in there. Mindfulness teaches us to engage our own selves, to know ourselves, to conduct ourselves better, to become better human beings in that sense. And that's a radical shift in where the curriculum is oriented. This is not just about studying the world out there, it's about studying the world in here. So some reservations about mindfulness in education. First of all, only very serious implementation of this practice can yield significant results. Just like when a teacher wants to teach math, she needs to learn math and know it properly. It's the same with mindfulness. It requires practice, requires understanding what this practice is about, how it can contribute, how it can be taught. So this is a discipline all its own. And not many can commit to this discipline. It has to do with sitting with oneself, observing. Usually we practice observing our breath and bodily sensations, and it takes commitment. It takes a daily practice and really engaging with it seriously. Also, there is still resistance to mindfulness because of its origins within Buddhism. Sometimes people believe that this has to do with some religion or spirituality necessarily, but that need not be the case. As we practice clapping our hands and observing the sensations there, this did not require faith in any god or any particular religion. It was just about exploring our own experiences as human beings. So there's something very, very universal here, and there's no necessary reason to connect such practices to a certain faith or belief. It also works well with any kind of belief that one has. One can be a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, and practice mindfulness, and there shouldn't be any contradiction there. Now, the science studying mindfulness still has a way to go. The way the practice is studied, the way it is implemented in schools, how to do it best, there's a lot to learn there too. Just to sum up this little talk, mindfulness education is a phenomenon that's clearly on the rise. Its ancient contemporary sources within Buddhism and science grant it with a variety of educational possibilities. We spoke mostly on these MBIs, but in some cases, or mindfulness is implemented in more holistic way and integrated into school day throughout the day in various ways. So contemporarily, it's mostly about stress reduction and about academic performance and enhancing social emotional learning. It could go even deeper than that to self-knowledge and understanding ourselves, understanding who we are. And that connotes with the last thing I said about mindfulness practice, which has to do with the fact that it shifts the curriculum from being oriented outside only to to being oriented inside to the individual, to her or his embodied mind, to exploring the self and realizing the self, which connotes well with this conference's theme. So thank you for listening to me. I'm Oren Ergas, Dr. Oren Ergas from Beit Berl College in Israel. And if you'd like to explore more about this field, there are a lot of publications in the link that I provide here at the end of this PowerPoint. So enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Como instancia transformadora, la educación contemplativa es una experiencia de consciencia, atención plena, respiración y postura dinámica del cuerpo. Es el cultivo de la humanidad a través de la amabilidad, la compasión y la gratitud. Es una práctica de autorrealización, coherencia y liderazgo de sí que con el tiempo se convierte en un rasgo de personalidad.